Welcome to the Young Indy Chroniclers, a podcast about the making of the show The Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, which first aired on ABC in 1992.
Kept thinking about what was Indiana Jones like as a young man. I came up with this idea of him seeing the world through the eyes of a soldier and a secret agent.
Over the course of our podcast, we're going to talk to a whole host of very talented people who either worked on this show or were there from the beginning.
We were able to shoot it on location in the real places where these events took place.
Oh, make it up as you go. Oh boy, that's great advice.
We hired some of the best European directors, a whole host of very, very talented people.
I'm your host, Peter Holmstrom.
And I'm Daniel Noah, and this is the Young Indy Chroniclers.
There's only one rule, Indiana. Stay alive.
Welcome back to the Young Indy Chroniclers, the one and only podcast devoted specifically to the Young Indiana Jones franchise. I'm your co-host, Peter Holmstrom, and joining me on this adventure of a lifetime is Mr. Daniel Noah.
Hello, Peter.
When looking at a work of art, the study of that work must, by definition, include a knowledge of the time and the place in which that art existed, to know not just what it's influenced by, but also what it was pushing up against in its efforts to be successful. Young Indiana Jones is often accused, sometimes in a complimentary way and other times in a negative way, in existing out of its time. But what is that time? What was the television and marketing landscape that Young Indiana Jones entered into in 1992? How did this differ from the first Indiana Jones film that came out 11 years before? And what ensured that the series would not, ultimately, last for 7 seasons? Today's show, we're going to be talking more about this topic and delving into some of the context that Young Indiana Jones came out in. To help us with this conversation is a film historian, author, and screenwriter in his own right, Mr. Ray Morton. Ray is best known for writing some behind-the-scenes histories books on King Kong, as well as Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and being a contributor to a number of oral history books, including some that I wrote myself. Ray, how you doing?
I'm doing fine, thank you. Thanks for having me on today.
So, Ray, I wonder if you could start by telling us a bit about your own history and how you first found Indiana Jones.
Well, I've been a film fan forever, since as long as I can recall, and a big Steven Spielberg fan since I first saw Jaws. And so I had been following him through Close Encounters in 1941. And then I remember about the end of 1979 hearing stories of him teaming up with George Lucas on this project that they wouldn't name. And then the interesting part is they finally did name it, and they called it Raiders of the Lost Ark. And they kept making a big deal out of saying, but it's spelled A-R-C, not A-R-K, because they were really concerned, I guess, that people would confuse it with Noah's Ark or something. And I just remember that was a constant thing, A-R-C, not A-R-K. Of course, that's not what it ended up being at all. But I was there opening night. I saw it in Stamford, Connecticut, which is where I was living at the time. And just blown away by Raiders, and big fan right from that moment.
Tonight, an ABC premiere presentation.
Do you realize what the Ark is? It's a transmitter for speaking to God.
Remember, this is the film that stopped you cold. From Lucas and Spielberg, a spectacular visual adventure.
Jones! Adios, senor.
Karen Allen, Harrison Ford.
Trust me.
Raiders of the Lost Ark, next.
Indiana Jones comes and it becomes just this very long, the success of it spans a year or two. What do you think that chord was that really struck with people that made it so successful?
When you think about Indiana Jones, especially the first film, it really is the birth of the modern action film, I think. Its antecedents are in the James Bond series as well, but I think Raiders is when everything took a big leap forward. And I think at the time, I remember when it came out, people had to be reintroduced to the idea of the serial, because at that point, serials were quite in the past, and there wasn't a lot of revival of them. A lot of revival movie theaters, but you didn't see much of the serials. Sometimes you saw the Batman stuff, but that was about all. And people didn't really understand, I think, the language of it. So I do remember that in my memory, the film was a hit from the beginning, but I've since looked it up, and it took a little while to get going with at the box office. And I think it's because people had to figure out what they were watching. Once they did, I think you saw the film just take off. It became a huge phenomenon. I remember seeing it a year and like a month later, still in a first run theater. And so it just kept playing and playing and playing all year. And that back then you could play all year with a film, but really only the giant blockbusters like Star Wars would do that. So by then Raiders had started slow, but it was a blockbuster, several weeks in.
Ray, a thought experiment I like to do is comparing Raiders of the Lost Ark to the Bond film that came out that year, which was For Your Eyes Only. And if you compare them sort of as action films, just how different they are. Can you, maybe for the audience, you kind of touched on this, how would you describe some of the changes that Raiders of the Lost Ark brought to the action genre, especially when you think of the other action films that may have come out that same year?
Right. Well, the big difference, and this is where it built on the Bond films, and it's a good comparison with For Your Eyes Only. The Bond films invented I don't know if invented, but they pioneered the idea of an action sequence every so often in the movie. Like before the Bonds, action movies might have a big sequence in the middle and then a huge climax.
The Magnificent Seven. They were only 7, but they fought like 700. Bring the kind of justice that would last.
Somehow I don't think you solved my problem.
Solving your problems isn't in our line.
And they didn't even call them action films. They call them action adventure movies. The Bond films, you sort of got this every 15, 20 minutes, there'd be a big action scene.
5 days ago, our spy ship was sunk in the Ionian Sea. She was equipped with ATAC.
Have we begun a salvage operation?
We asked Sir Timothy Havelock to secretly locate the wreck. He and his wife were killed by Hector Gonzalez. Police were able to identify Gonzalez by Melina, Sir Havelock's daughter.
Oh, by the way, we haven't been properly introduced, Melina. My name is Bond. James Bond.
So Raiders takes that, and building on the serial concept, you have a major action sequence every 10 minutes or so.
Daniel! I'll tell you everything.
Yes, I know you will.
Let her go.
Get out of here! Fowler, get down here!
The dog is going out!
Hold it! Stop there! Never mind! Get back!
Indy, we have no time. If you still want the Ark, it has been loaded onto a truck for Cairo.
Truck? What truck?
And that really just ramped the whole thing up. You also had the invention of Steven Spielberg as the director and all of the ideas that he and George Lucas and Lawrence Kasdan had come up with. So you were not only doing these action sequences every few minutes, but they were just bigger and better made and more into the craft than I think a lot of the action films at that time were. In those days, you would sort of set up 6 cameras and film a car crash and then edit that all together. But Spielberg's such a master of the craft that it was a much more precise, much bigger, much more imaginative. So you combine that with the frequency, and that's what you start seeing in the action movies that come after. Things start getting bigger and wilder and honestly much less realistic, which was cool up to a point and then kind of
All right.
Yeah.
But, I know that a lot has been made over the years of the truck chase in Raiders, and deservedly so, because it's amazing. But it's also like referencing and, directly lifting from movies like Stagecoach and a lot of Westerns from the 30s and 40s. But also, as you pointed out, it's like there was like a 20 or 30 year gap there where there just wasn't action like that. And especially not in relation to cars either. And so like Indiana Jones coming out just like felt like, even though it was harkening back to all these older movies, it feels like such a breath of fresh air in so many ways.
It was that sort of that great idea of old wine in a new bottle. Like they took this material from these older serials and then put it in this spectacular big, it's a B movie, but it's a B movie on an A movie budget, on an A movie scale. And then they took it even a little further because they add that element of mysticism to it that suddenly takes it a little bit above just an action adventure picture, and suddenly you have this slightly different dimension to it, a little bit more in line with what Spielberg and Lucas were known for. And that's where you get this kind of new concoction, I think.
I'm beginning to understand Hitler's interest in this.
Oh, yes. The Bible speaks of the ark leveling mountains and laying waste to entire regions. An army which carries the ark before it is invincible.
There's a real elevation to the material by adding that sort of spiritual element. It's kind of like the Jedi in Star Wars, right? There's an element of that makes it more than just good guys and bad guys shooting at each other. I was wondering, looking at the 80s, as of course, there were two more sequels in that decade. What would you say were, maybe the top 3 action franchises of the 1980s? What would you say those were? Would you count Indiana Jones among them? I'm guessing you would, but what would you say its competition was?
I think at that period, Indiana Jones, Raiders was probably the top one in terms of action, because Star Wars was kind of wrapping up at that point, but also that's a little bit more in science fiction and fantasy. I don't know if it counts as a full franchise because only 2 films at the time, but I think the Mad Max movies.
They say people don't believe in heroes anymore. Well, damn them. You and me, Max. We're gonna give them back their heroes.
Max is a main force officer trying to protect his family and stay alive. Mad Max, the maximum force of the future.
Mad Max 2 came out the same year Raiders did in Australia, came out here a year later. Both had spectacular action filmed in ways people had never seen them before. So I think that highly influential, whether there's only 2 films, but every movie made after that, every science fiction action picture was influenced by the Mad Max movies. And I think the Bonds still.
The name that means excitement is back. Bond. James Bond.
That girl must be very talented.
Believe me, my interest in her is purely professional.
What is this?
I've had a few optional extras installed. 2 of our men are dead. Koskov's named you. Then I must die.
James Bond, 007, The Living Daylights.
The Bonds were, kept coming every 2 years, I think, maintained their high watermark of action, although there was a certain point where they probably started to seem a little old-fashioned.
Oh, Commander Bond.
Call me James. It's 5 days to Alaska.
Later on, you had like the Lethal Weapon films and things like that. The sort of, the Joel Silver kind of stuff.
Hey, you all right, man? Yeah, I'm okay. Where were you, man? You my partner or what? Why didn't you follow me down?
Yeah, why didn't you follow him down?
Shut up! I'm 7 floors up!
Good police work, officer.
Come on, back to my place. Hey, I'll even cook.
You're lucky. I have to live with that. New York cop John McClane has come to see his wife.
I missed you.
Instead, he's going to have to save her.
Do you really think you have a chance against us, Mr. Cowboy?
Yippee-ki-yay,
But I don't think those really gelled until more the end of the decade, like in terms of making them a series.
I think it's also worth pointing out how important Harrison Ford is to the equation, right? Where it's not only that Harrison Ford is, he in a way reintroduced this idea of like a roguish hero into the mix, but even in Star Wars, he's the sidekick, he's the co-lead, I guess you could say, and you see other films kind of trading off of this in the future. But with Indy, he becomes the roguish hero as your lead character, and that becomes a character type that does carry on, I think, in the late 80s, as you mentioned, with Lethal Weapon, things like that, where it's like, it's no longer that you have these like innocent heroes like Luke Skywalker as your heroes, the farm boys or whatever. It's like, no, your heroes can be troubled. They can have depth, and they have a very roguish quality to it. I think that's a very important note for looking at Indiana Jones as a franchise.
Ooh, Attila, the professor? He was never giddy, even when he was a schoolboy.
This is Miss Scott. This is Mr. Round.
Shut down.
My name is Indiana Jones.
Yes. It's the mileage.
What would you say, because I think about the character of Indiana Jones. We had the Captain America movies, right, 2011 in the last decade, and they are, they create this hero from the 1940s, the Greatest Generation, and they're sort of trading off of our impressions of that. to create that character, that righteous hero. Yeah. Indiana Jones is arguably a member of that generation, the character is, but he doesn't seem to be drawn from that sort of cherubic, character. He's a bit of an anti-hero. He's the kind of guy you would, he shoots a guy with a sword, like he's not the Miss Dudley Do-Right, right? Are there either cinematic antecedents to that? Does that come from a movement of the time, late 70s, early 80s? Is there anything to suggest why they might have chosen to portray their serial hero in that fashion as opposed to maybe a more straight-laced figure?
I think there would be two reasons for that. The first is Spielberg has always said that his visual model for Indiana Jones was Humphrey Bogart. And I think specifically Humphrey Bogart in Treasure of Sierra Madre.
Dogs, soldier of fortune. These are the men who tried to tap the treasure of the Sierra Madre. Men with an oath on their lips and muscles in their arms, but men with greed in their hearts.
He's a darker character. He's a down-on-his-luck guy who makes some really bad choices.
The sooner the better, as far as I'm concerned. I don't want to keep that dame waiting, whoever she is. We wounded this mountain. It's our duty to close her wounds. The least we can do to show our gratitude for the wealth she's given us.
You talk about that mountain like it was a real woman. You've been a lot better to me than any woman I ever knew.
Now, that's not what Indiana Jones was, but visually they were going for something like that, a little rougher around the edges, not the squeaky clean hero. I also think you're talking about a film that was conceived at the end of the 70s, conceived and written at the end of the 70s, when we were a little more interested in the tarnished hero, a little more interested in the anti-hero, and honestly not afraid of a character with a few warts on them to be the hero of something. Whereas I think prior to the 70s, you couldn't have a disreputable hero. And even after in the 80s, sort of fake dark characters, if you will, like they're still kind of stalwart. Indy in the first Indiana Jones film is a pretty disreputable guy in a lot of it. He's a grave robber. That's what they call him.
I got these pieces. They're good pieces, Marcus. Look.
Indiana. Yes, the museum will buy them as usual. No questions asked. Yes, they are nice.
Professor of archaeology, expert on the occult, and how does one say it? Obtainer of rare antiquities.
One way of saying it. Why don't you sit down? You'll be more comfortable.
I love that scene in Temple of Doom when he's like, they go through the list of countries that have sort of outlawed him and the crimes he's committed,
I seem to remember that in Honduras you were accused of being a grave robber rather than an archaeologist.
Well, the newspapers greatly exaggerated the incident.
And wasn't it the Sultan of Madagascar who threatened to cut your head off if you ever returned to his country?
No, it wasn't my head.
Then your hands, perhaps?
No, it wasn't my hands. It was my misunderstanding.
There was an interesting evolution of Indy all through the three films in the 80s, because in the first film, he's this grubby, dark grave robber, as they keep calling him. By Last Crusade, he's the guy who rescues artifacts because they belong in a museum. I'm like, boy, did that guy change quite a bit.
That belongs in a museum.
So do you. Throw him over the side.
Well, he had a transformational experience, but actually that's a great segue. That talking about the third one. The third one is where we get that righteous motivation. It's also where we are introduced to this idea of Indiana Jones as a young man.
You got heart, kid, but that belongs to me.
Belongs to Coronado.
Coronado's dead, and so are all of his grandchildren.
This should be in a museum.
When that came out, there had been two films. People knew the franchise. There was a little bit of a break, more of a break between 2 and 3, about 5 years, I think, which I feel like at that time was long. I don't feel like a lot of those franchises in the 80s were taking 5-year breaks. So what was the perception at the time this movie came out? How did people receive it? Were there reactions specifically to that prologue? What do you recall?
Well, it's funny when you mentioned the 5-year break. There was a feeling, because in those days, the Star Wars movies were 3 years apart. The Bonds were 2 years apart. And then there was 3 years, obviously, between Raiders and Temple of Doom. After the third year passed, I think people started to actually think maybe that was it for Indiana Jones, because there didn't seem to be a lot of action on it. Like, you didn't hear, oh, we're getting ready to do one. You only heard these kind of vague things. I remember when they finally announced they were making it, it was exciting, but also a little like, gee, it's been a while. I think audiences in those days especially were very much, films were aimed at the teen audience. So you had a bunch of people who hadn't really even seen an Indiana Jones movie in the theater. And then the older audience, I think, was starting to forget it a little bit because 5 years was quite a bit of time. But I'll tell you, when the first trailer came out, I forget what movie I was watching when it came out, but you could hear the audience get excited.
On Wednesday, May 24th, Paramount Pictures invites you to have the adventure of your life.
Dad! Dad!
Keeping up with the Joneses.
Are you crazy? Don't go between them! Go between them! Are you crazy?
Harrison Ford. Sean Connery.
You call this archaeology?
Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Rated PG-13. Starts Wednesday, May 24th at theaters everywhere.
And when the first poster came out, you could also see that. I saw it opening day at the Chinese, and it was packed, and the audience really loved it. And, it depends on your age, I think, but Temple of Doom at that time had left a little bit of a bad taste in people's mouths. It's been sort of reassessed since, but it was I think people were really excited when Last Crusade was more fun. The darkness of Temple of Doom was a little tough for some folks to swallow.
And did that prologue with Young Indy, was that something that sort of contributed to that sense of fun? That he is that Boy Scout in the first scene. Like, he's everything he's sort of not.
What I thought was exciting about it, and what I am hearing the audience react, all of the bits where Indy becomes Indy. So, getting his scar and getting his hat and getting his whip. And it was just fun, I think the prequel ideas kind of gotten a little out of hand these days, but then it was just kind of a wink and a nod to the audience. And I remember the audience just really cheering, and especially when it transitioned to Harrison Ford and he was still after the cross, whatever it was, 20 years later. People were really applauding that in the theater.
You lost today, kid. It doesn't mean you have to like it.
Yeah, I love that line. He's like, I've been searching. It's, again, overplayed now, but when he was like, I've been looking for this my whole life, it's great moment.
We can discuss my honoraries over dinner and champagne tonight. Your treat.
Yes, my treat.
I'm of that generation where that was the first Indiana Jones movie I saw. I was too young I was alive when it was in theaters, but I was too young to go. But I saw it on videotape. And to me, that movie, when I was a young kid, that was Indiana Jones. That was the one that I watched. That was the one I sort of experienced. And I didn't see Young Indiana Jones on television, but I experienced the marketing. Being a kid at that time, I was the target. You know what I mean? So I was getting coloring books, and merchandising was sort of hitting me. From your perspective, Young Indy comes out 3 years, so it's as if they were making another movie. Did you hear word of it? What was the first time you heard they were doing a Young Indiana Jones series, and what did you think when you heard that?
I remember hearing, I guess it was about a year after Last Crusade came out, and that prologue had been very well received by audiences, by critics. So it wasn't that big a surprise. It was kind of like, oh, okay, that makes sense that they're going to expand that. I was curious, and in those days, I think I was always interested in what George Lucas would come up with, because he just doesn't think the way a lot of other people do. So when I first saw the announcement, I just figured it was going to be a regular action series, and hopefully it would be good, is what I thought. I also knew there was no way Harrison Ford was going to be in it, and I pretty much figured they weren't going to have River Phoenix in it. So I was curious as to what they would do about the casting. And then I don't think I heard too much about it. Like, I knew it was in the works, but when the press started a little bit ahead of when the show actually came on, and suddenly there's going to be 3 Indies in the show, and there's going to be little boy Indy, and 20-year-old Indy, and 93-year-old Indy. And then I started to feel like, okay, this is a George Lucas project.
Filmed on location in 11 countries around the world, Lucas follows the adventures of young Indy at two important stages in his life.
The overall themes that evolved for the 10-year-old is an intellectual coming of age, being exposed to ideas and places and concepts. And for the older boy, the 16-year-old, it's an emotional coming of age, dealing with situations he must reflect on and deal with.
I don't think it's a great movie, but one of my favorite of his produced films is More American Graffiti. Not because it's a great film, because I don't think it is, but you could see the way he's thinking, where I'm going to do a movie set in 4 different time periods, using 4 different, aspect ratios and whatever. And so then I'm hearing it's, Little Indy and I guess Middle Indy and Old Indy. I'm like, okay, now I'm curious as to see what he's up to with this. I think, unfortunately, it was probably one of the reasons the show, I don't think it went down so easily with audiences, but man, was that just some clever thinking on that man's part.
Before the world discovered Indiana Jones, a young Indiana Jones discovered the world.
Dear Dad, I've joined the Mexican Revolution.
Riding with Pancho Villa.
Sorry about high school.
Exploring with Lawrence of Arabia. On safari in Africa with Teddy Roosevelt. And romancing a German spy. For him, just growing up was the greatest adventure of all.
If I don't get home, my father's gonna kill me.
The minute I saw you, I knew you were a lucky kid.
From the Great Wall of China to running guns in the Congo. From battling tomb robbers to fighting in the trenches of World War I. To first love in wartime London.
Do you love me? Question is, do you love me?
He lives a life others only dream of.
Definitely gonna miss high school.
Now, coming Wednesday, March 4th, all new adventures. George Lucas presents the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles.
I found some of the original ratings for the time period to coincide with the premiere of Young Indiana Jones. So I just wanted to kind of go down a bit of that, just to show and tell the audience kind of what the series was up against at the time. So the show premieres on March 4th, 1992, as talked about in the past. 2-part premiere, feature-length, a 90-minute-long premiere, The Curse of the Jackal. And that won its time slot. It actually had, on Wednesday, March 4th, it got 26.7 million viewers in the States. Second place was Unsolved Mysteries.
Hang on, just one thing. I work at television now. 26 million viewers. That's unheard of. That's insane. That would be a mind-blowing hit. I'm sorry. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Number 2 for that Wednesday, not for the week, but for that Wednesday, was Unsolved Mysteries, which is a great series. So I can't really, and that got 24 million viewers.
Tonight, a special edition of Unsolved Mysteries. Iraqi President Saddam Hussein murdered thousands of rivals in his rise to power.
A cunning mind, unrestrained by conscience. Some call them psychopaths, others call them sociopaths. We call them diabolical minds.
I believe that would have been season 4 or 5 of that show. Then third place was a show called Davis Rules on CBS, 14.2.
Can I just do something and have no idea why?
Is it because you want to be that person?
Well, even if I wanted to be, I'm only 16 years old.
Skinner, I'm not looking for someone to take care of me. I have plenty of time to get married if I want to, and I already have a baby, so the pressure's off there.
So you're saying that you don't need to be around anybody?
I like being around you.
Brooklyn Bridge, also on CBS, 11.8.
I think we need to at least know what the request is first.
I think Bernie has a point, Dad.
Go ahead, Sylvia, dear. Request.
Well, I know how interested everybody here is in culture. And I remember how when I was little, the club paid for Cousin Robert's violin lessons and kept right on paying for them, even long after it became clear that Robert was never really going to be able to play anything on the violin.
Murphy Brown after that, also on CBS. CBS kind of knocking it out of the park with this week. Murphy Brown, CBS, 16.9.
Hey, Rick! Wait, there's still so much we don't know about you. Like, where were you born? Where'd you go to school?
Born in Maryland, graduated Northwestern, and yes, I'm gay.
Seinfeld, which I feel like maybe was season 1 or 2.
That would have to be really early.
You know who's a good actor? Anthony Quinn.
Oh, Anthony Quinn, fine actor. But from what I understand, not a very good driver. Hits everything on the road, but always leaves a note.
Did you ever see Zorba the Greek?
Excellent film. In fact, Quinn said he never felt so good as when he left a note after smacking into a car.
And then Designing Women, CBS 15.4, Night Court on NBC 14.7. And then 48 Hours, which is a news show. And there's another show called Homefront, which I feel like maybe was also a news show. I'm not sure, on ABC. And those are rounding out the night. Quantum Leap on NBC with 14.6. And then the next week, I just want to bring up the next week really quick because I think it illustrates as well what the show is up against on a week-to-week basis. The following week, it didn't win number 1. It was bumped down to number 7 or so.
Wow.
But it didn't have as much of a downgrade in ratings, but I think it was just up against some different kind of competition. But number 1 there was Unsolved Mysteries at 27.8. The Wonder Years gets 19.2. Doogie Howser, 21.1. Seinfeld actually gets a lot more ratings that week, and 21.3 in a rerun, actually. It's very interesting. Jake and the Fat Man, if anyone remembers that show, 17.1.
Cash, some paperwork that was in the trunk, and a few other personal items.
Oh, I'll be damned. That's it. It's those French cigarettes. Here, there's some right here, see? So? When I went by Carolyn Loy's house yesterday, there was an ashtray filled with cigarette butts.
A million viewers. Young Indy comes in that week at Young Indy, so this would be episode 2.
I think it was London, 1916 was aired second.
For him, just growing up
This is Miss Prentice.
was the greatest adventure of all.
Henry was a remarkable boy and shows every sign of growing up to be a remarkable man. Do you love me?
Question is, do you love me?
The press calls it spectacular, dazzling, one of the best TV shows that ever happened. Tomorrow, George Lucas presents the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles.
That one got 19 million viewers, so it's still holding pretty strong, but it's I guess that would be fourth place right there for that week. But that's kind of what it's up against on a week to week there.
Well, certainly no action adventure. I mean, maybe Quantum Leap, but that's really more sci-fi. So there's no action adventure competition. Now, of course, it's not really an action adventure show, although the pilot does have a fair bit of action. So I don't know, obviously not being an adult at that time, what the perception was, but certainly Young Indy doesn't sound like any of those shows.
It doesn't. Ray, what do you think about that?
The rundown of the shows you provided, we're going to what I was going to say, like the early 90s in television was probably the height of the resurgence of the sitcom, you know, which had started with Cosby and Family Ties in the 80s. Sure. But almost anything I can think of that was memorable from them was a sitcom. On network, the action stuff was like Jake and the Fat Man, which, you know, is just another cop detective show.
And now, back to Jake and the Fat Man.
Hey, look over here on the carpet. That's a cigarette butt. This is probably evidence.
What do you think was in that Danish? You think it was cheese? Because I got a little problem with cheese.
There were still a bunch of those running, but I can't even remember what they were. The other one that probably would have appealed to indie fans was when Star Trek The Next Generation was probably at its height, but that was a syndicated show. But that was, it was much more prominent than it had been when it first started. But yeah, indie was unlike anything else that had been on. I do know when it came on, I mean, the advanced publicity was huge. So it doesn't surprise me that it did so well in its first outing. But I remember even when I watched it, I enjoyed it, but I also thought this is not an Indiana Jones show, like in the sense that this is not a movie serial action show, which I think through the audience, you know. But you know, again, smart and interesting and different. And different is not always a good thing. And, well, certainly not in network TV in those days. Different was not a great thing. So.
I think it's also worth pointing out that the big difference between Young Indy and the other shows I just talked about was serialization versus episodic television. And that, this was an era where like you did not serialize anything. Like if you did, it was maybe a soap opera or whatever. But it's like, I think back to all these shows and like, they're all very episodic, and with maybe the exception of the Wonder Years, I guess there's kind of a serialized element to that series. But like for the most part, it's all very episodic television. And so like having Young Indy in there being like, we're going to trace a guy's life and kind of carry, you have to pay attention to what's going on week to week. Harder to keep up with.
Well, like Ray pointed out, you're tracking it in 2 time periods too. That first episode gives you 2 time periods, and then you it's like a weird abstract exercise of watching it. Slightly. That first season is more or less chronological, as I recall. Of course, they went back and they sort of filled stuff in, but you're still bouncing times at least once or twice. I think twice in that first season.
Yeah, 2 times.
And to your point, a TV show then was like standing sets and, an environment where you would return to every week and a supporting cast that you would return to every week. And this is like a mini series. This is more like Roots.
Tonight, we present a landmark in television entertainment. Roots, the true story Alex Haley uncovered in his 12-year search across the 7 generations of his ancestry. After 2 years of production, we present this incredible saga in an epic motion picture. Roots, the current #1 best-selling novel, is the television event of the year.
Where you're going to just follow a character through this journey, which, they did a handful of times on TV, in those days. But what were people saying about the show in those first few weeks?
I think it depended on how, I think diehard Indiana Jones fans, diehard Spielberg and Lucas fans, thought it was interesting. I don't think anybody was completely grabbed by it because it was not exactly what they're expecting. But I remember personally feeling like I want to see where this goes. It was a little tricky to follow. Probably, I'm thinking it would have been much more at home these days where we're much more used to time shifting and all of that kind of stuff in storytelling. I think for the general audience, as I'm sort of remembering, I'm thinking of people that I would have known who maybe were not diehard fans of this stuff, I think they kind of started to lose interest. Because I don't want to be unkind to anyone, but nobody was really in love with Corey Carrier. I think people were a little not off-put, that wouldn't be fair, but I don't think people were that interested. Sean Patrick Flannery, I think people were more interested in. I think more personality. The problem when you do the precocious kid thing is that it turns as many people off as it attracts. And I remember feeling people weren't that interested in that material. But I think Flannery did a good job because he was following on the heels of River Phoenix. And I think there was some thought, gee, is anybody going to do it as well as he did? I recall him being very well received by fans and by general audiences.
Who are all these people?
Writers, actors, painters, composers, anarchists, socialists, the usual village crowd. Do you know any of them?
Me? No. I just snuck in for some free food. Whose party is this anyway?
Mine.
Well, even now, when you watch some of those Corey Carrier episodes, the plots seem very repetitive. And they may not have all been aired back to back, but it pretty much is. Indy runs away, Indy gets in trouble. And, towards the end, maybe some of the later ones, they started to do some other things, but there's at least 4 about in a row of essentially the same plot in a different country with a different historical figure, And I get why people kind of okay, But Flannery, at that point, I believe he was an unknown actor. So I can't imagine anyone would have been familiar with him. But was there a sense maybe that, this could be a career-making, turn for him? Was the notice is that good, or was it sort of just more interesting?
My personal recollection of watching and experiencing it, and my recollection of the reaction to the show, was he was considered the bright spot of it. It was again, following on River Phoenix, but doing quite well at it. I mean, he's a charming guy and held the screen really well. And I feel like he was probably the thing people were the most enthusiastic about. If you were lukewarm about the rest of it, you still liked him.
I guess a question too would be looking back at that time as Daniel pointed out earlier, it's, television was standing sets. If you see the stage in a corner, that's okay, because that's just what TV was. And there was still kind of this holdover from the 80s of like, television is not a place where actors go to thrive in a way. This is where you have a good career, but you're never going to become a movie actor, right? If you're in television. And yet here we have Young Indy, which is trying very hard to look like cinema, right? And like, was there do you recall if there was a sense, and I don't mean just Young Indy here, but I kind of mean any mini-series or any of these attempts to try to make television a little more cinematic, a little more serialized, let's say. I mean, we could talk about Twin Peaks a bit here in the same sentence, I think.
Entering the town of Twin Peaks. You think I killed her? Sheriff, we got a lot to talk about.
These attempts to kind of push the genre, or push the medium, I guess, of television. Was there a sense of like, this is never gonna fly, this is never gonna happen, television is what it is, it can't be anything different? Or was there ever like a sense of like, this could be possible, also like the miniseries Shogun or something like that, where it's like, these or Roots as well, right, where it's like high acclaim, but like how were these kind of pushing of the boundary signs, how were these received at the time?
Well, I think there was a difference in perception in those days between regular television and what they probably would have referred to as event television back then. So the miniseries, like the best miniseries were Roots and Shogun, and there was Holocaust, and I wasn't a fan, but like the Thornbirds was a big deal.
This is Shogun, the staggering saga of feudal Japan. The story of ruling warlords battling for ultimate supremacy. They are challenged by a stranger from across the seas, John Blackthorne, the one man with the power to change Japan's destiny for all time. This is the opening chapter of the 6-part presentation starring Richard Chamberlain and Toshiro Mifune.
Only one other film of this magnitude has received such critical acclaim: Holocaust.
We'll solve a multitude of problems simply by attacking Jews.
How much worse can they get? We're no longer citizens. We have no legal rights. Our property can be confiscated in the name of humanity. What else can you do to us?
What is his crime? What has he done?
And the New York Post says every American family should see Holocaust.
Tomorrow night on the Thornbirds.
Megan's my wife, not yours.
Then be a husband to her, man.
I hate Luke. Stop. And I hate it, baby.
I have broken all my vows.
The Thornbirds, tomorrow night at 9 on Channel 4.
And those tended to have bigger production values, and they were serialized in the sense that they were telling a longer story over many more episodes, but they also had a finite ending. It was also The Winds of War. That was the other really big one. And so you could sort of get the whole experience in a contained piece. But also at that time, TV had already started to push the serialization boundaries with Hill Street Blues.
Thursday on Hill Street Blues.
Just turn around for a second.
Bates blames herself for a young prostitute's overdose.
I lost her.
I would have arrested her for possession. I sure wouldn't have turned my back while she shot up.
And Davenport forces a showdown.
Just once, I'd like to kiss you in public.
We had a pretty good thing going, Pizza Man, and you screwed it up.
Thursday.
And then probably more popularly with LA Law, and the other one was St. Elsewhere. Those three shows had started to break the episodic format to some degree. But, they didn't use this term then, but then there was what was sort of considered the prestige television. And NBC had that market cornered at that time because that was when it was still being run by Grant Tinker and Brandon Tartikoff. And so Thursday night on NBC was really smart situation comedies and then these serialized dramas like St. Elsewhere and Hill Street. So those things were well received. But what's interesting is I think the miniseries were well received because they were contained. You could watch the 8 episodes or the 7 episodes and it was over. I think things like Young Indy had a problem because it almost felt like a miniseries, but it kept going. So I think the audience was probably trained to look for it to end at that time. I don't think we would feel that way now. The other thing is, you're talking about the era before any kind of high def. And the thing is, there's only so much production value you could get across on television in those days, no matter how well it was done. Like, I'm thinking of Shogun was probably the most elaborate miniseries and a good-looking show, but you were still limited by the square box and only so much resolution. So as much as you could try to make it cinematic, that whole idea, I don't think really flew until until more high def stuff started coming in more in like the late 90s, really.
I want to keep this ratings thing going here for a second, just one more time, but I want to talk about the season 2 ratings. So season 2 of Young Indy from 1992 to 1993, plagued by moving around in the schedule a lot. Many times people didn't even know when it would be on. The final episodes notoriously didn't even have kind of nationwide releases. It was kind of a regional release pattern, just because ABC was kind of like, we just don't know what to do with this. But season 2 premiered on Monday, September 21st, 1992, up against shows Evening Shade on CBS.
That's a sitcom.
That one, but that got 23.6 million viewers.
In the small town of Evening Shade, Arkansas, high school coach Wood Newton has his hands full.
I have not won a game in 2.5 years.
His luck could be changing. Meet his new assistant.
I guess you know a little bit about football, huh?
No.
But today's his birthday, and his wife Ava has a special surprise.
I'm pregnant.
Coach seems a little down.
He's got those over the hill, my wife's off the pill, and my vasectomy didn't take blues.
Brooke Reynolds heads an all-star cast in Evening Shade, Mondays on CBS.
Fresh Prince of Bel-Air got a 22.7.
Night, Sister Mary Margaret. Danny, have you lost weight?
Whoa, Sister Mary Margaret drives a Porsche? Man, they must got it going on down at the convent, huh?
Young Indy, those two shows were up against Young Indy on ABC, and that was 11.2 million viewers there. Hearts Afire, Afire being one word, 26.9 million on CBS. Blossom is still there on NBC, 20.5. Murphy Brown, 44 million viewers that week. That's a lot. Also, NFL was playing that night, 22.7. And then Love and War on CBS, 23.5. And then I also just want to say the following week, Northern Exposure premieres. So all these things would be competition for Young Indy.
What's funny is I'm not sure the football numbers are that different today. I'd have to look at that, but I feel like it still happens.
Probably.
But, it's funny because I'm guessing that was the premiere of Murphy Brown versus when it came out in the spring, it was probably Murphy Brown had probably been on, so you weren't up against the premiere. But am I correct that the opener of season 2 has Harrison Ford? And you're telling me Harrison Ford can no. Okay.
That was the mid-season premiere. That's a good question, though. I will look that up as we.
Because he better have had more than 11 million viewers. I'm sorry, Harrison Ford can only bring in 11 million viewers. Maybe that's the average. Maybe they all watched the beginning and they left. Because I can't have that. That's not okay.
No. So the season 2 premiere was Austria, March 1915. So that's the one where Indy and the two princes are trying to convince Austria to
That's a decent episode. Good action.
That's a good episode. Yeah, it's a very good episode. Christopher Lee. Anybody?
Christopher Lee, directed by the stunt. I'm forgetting his name, but the stunt coordinator from Raiders and
Dick Armstrong.
That's it.
Dick Armstrong.
Vic Armstrong.
Oh, yeah, right.
Let's get one thing straight. We're not here on holiday. This is damn serious business.
I don't think we need you to tell us that.
I think you do. Look at you, dressed like a couple of Parisian dandies off of the gaming tables.
But yeah, so like up against some stiff competition though.
Most of those were sitcoms.
Ray, were you a fan of any of those shows at that time? Most of those were
Murphy
sitcoms.
Brown.
Yeah.
I was. It's funny. That's a show I just caught up on one of those rerun channels, and it didn't age well. But I was a fan of that at the time. The rest of them I was not a particularly fan of, but they were all sitcoms except for Unsolved Mysteries and football. But yeah, sitcoms were the big deal in those days.
That's so interesting that you say that, because of course it makes sense. I mean, I remember, even for kids, there was so many half-hour comedic shows that are essentially sitcoms. But what a hostile marketplace, I suppose, for Young Indy. You might think counter-programming, but I always thought, not always, but because it didn't exist, but it seems like in early 2000s HBO, like when they did Band of Brothers, right? That a Young Indy show in that environment, maybe with those, it had great production values, but with that technology, right? That's what you're talking about, the more high-def production, would have been really interesting, or it would have maybe been better received. Certainly, even I started watching it on VHS in the late 90s, I guess 99, whenever they came out on VHS. I didn't feel prepared for what the show was. I didn't have, I had no awareness of the tone or the nature of it. And so when I figured out, this is like a serious, historical drama, fictionalized, but essentially the stakes are true, and we're talking about some real situations here, and we're putting characters through some real experiences. I was really impressed and into that, as a young teenager. But it wasn't something that I certainly got from the marketing, even the stuff I remembered as a kid, the coloring books and the comics and stuff like that. I feel like the marketing, and this is television marketing departments, really was sort of selling that adventure show, maybe young adult adventure show, but nonetheless, that adventure show that people probably thought the show was, because that's probably the easy thing to do in 1992. And it got people to the pilot, right? But it seems like they kind of missed on that it would have been better served telling people, well, this is what it is. You should watch it, but we're not going to tell you that it's, gangbusters every week.
The way in which the show was produced, I think, also ultimately worked against it a little bit, in the sense that, if I'm remembering it correctly, and I'm imagining you guys know this better, but the whole first year was finished, or at least well along, before the show premiered. And that, I remember reading about that and thinking that was cool, but the problem is they didn't have the ability to course correct. And that's one of the things about network television, is you got to see what's working. And if 3 or 4 weeks in, whatever you have isn't working, you can start to adjust it. And I don't think Lucas gave ABC the show they thought they were getting. And again, George Lucas is going to do what he's going to do, and what he did was quite interesting, but it wasn't, I think, what they thought they were going to get. I don't think they knew how to promote it, so they promoted it. Hey, it's Indiana Jones, we're going to do that, and then I think they just stopped promoting it at a certain point.
You've convinced me. We got to track down someone in the ABC marketing department for 1992. We got to get them on the record.
I absolutely think we need to do that. But I also think this is one of those examples of Lucasfilm themselves and their marketing machine really pumping out a lot of content before the show even comes out. Whether it's the Young Indiana Jones trading card game, or the Young Indiana Jones Super Nintendo game. The marketing machine for this series was very immense, and I think that was all coming from Lucas's experiences on Star Wars and even Indiana Jones previously, where it's just like you cater to the fan base even before you maybe even have a fan base, and I think it was a smart move in a lot of ways. But it is true though that none of the material that really came out prepared viewers for what the show was going to be, which was a lot more thoughtful than what the movie series had been. So just to hop back to the ratings charts for a moment here, let's talk about the Harrison Ford appearance.
Tonight, it's Harrison Ford in a world premiere Indiana Jones movie.
Not my first time,
So this was a spring premiere for the show. It came at a time when the show moved to Saturday nights and was there for 6 episodes. And I think to a degree, to touch on what Ray was talking about earlier, is the show came out in chunks. And I think partly that's because of the way it was shot. It wasn't quite on the assembly line process that Hollywood was used to. So I think ABC kind of staggered the release out of fear that maybe they just wouldn't have enough episodes after a while, which also kind of, I think, hurt the show in the long run. But here we are, spring 1993, March 13th. It has a kind of mid-season spring season premiere for Young Indy. And it starts with The Mystery of the Blues, which is a 2-part movie of the week. It has Harrison Ford in it to do some bookends. So it would be a pretty big deal at that time, as Harrison Ford was one of the biggest stars on the planet. Comes out Saturday night. ABC gets 18.2 million viewers. So definitely a nice perk, nice boost. But also Saturday night doesn't help. It's up against Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman. Dr. Quinn gets 23.6 million.
I was going to say, that would have been hard for me. I love Jane Seymour. You're going to make me choose between Harrison Ford or Jane Seymour. I don't know what team I'm on.
When prejudice ignites rage,
How dare you do this to another man?
It's just an Indian man.
a frontier woman goes up against the notorious General Custer, Dr. Quinn Saturday.
I think, honestly, the more disappointing thing is just see how many reruns are out that week that are also getting very decent or close to competing ratings. Cops, a rerun of that is getting 18 million. That's a reality show, which wouldn't cost...
I know what network that's on.
Yeah, exactly. Let's see what else here. World Figure Skating, 15.2. Code 3 on Fox. Don't know what that is, but it got 16.9. And then a Code 3 rerun after that. So it's a half-hour show, so I imagine it's either sitcom
show, but based like about ambulances and things. So, but basically the same thing.
Oh, okay. Okay, that makes sense. All right. Then Commish on ABC. That rings a bell.
Commish.
The Commish?
Commish.
Meet the Commish.
You're in Tonyland. Book up.
He takes the law to the letter.
I now pronounce you
Under arrest.
And spells trouble for the bad guys. The Commish, 7:30 Wednesday on Channel 9.
20 million viewers.
Wow, 20 million people.
And that wins that time slot. NBC had Reasonable Doubts at 10 o'clock, 10.7. And then CBS had a show called Raven on CBS, 10.5. So, a bit of a perk, but not a big one. And like I said, that's on Saturday nights for 6 episodes. Ratings are dwindling, though, at that point.
Ray, do you recall, was there any marketing about Harrison Ford's appearance at the time?
Yeah, there was. What I'm recalling, this may not be 100% accurate, but what I remember is it had been off for a while. Like I don't think it was.
It had been, yeah.
And I remember seeing the ad, like, I don't know, probably somewhere in the week before. So you knew it was coming, but it wasn't sort of heavily promoted. And also the moving to Saturday night. At that point, moving a thing to Saturday night was a downgrade. There was a period in the 70s where Saturday night was the night you wanted to be on, but by the 90s, that was not the night. So I do remember seeing the ad. I watched it. I made a point of I don't know what I was doing, but I stayed home to watch it, and because I wanted to see Harrison. But I think even then it had a little bit of a desperation feeling a little bit to it, like come see Harrison, but see him on Saturday night when when you're not going to be watching TV otherwise.
It's funny though, because now in retrospect, it's a great little sequence with him, and I always felt like, man, it would have been cool to get it like a 1994 Indiana Jones movie with him with the beard.
Yeah.
That would have been cool.
And the only indie directed by George Lucas, actually.
Yeah,
that's right. And there was footage of that on that new documentary that just came out, which was cool. Seeing him kind of direct him and be like, "Can he walk over here?" And he goes, "Well, we're going to see it." That was cool.
It's also an interesting choice to have him on for that specific episode, The Mystery of the Blues, because you'd almost think like the obvious choice would be get him on something like Treasure of the Peacock, or something more in line with the movie franchise.
That was just George Lucas thumbing his nose at us.
Exactly.
Like he always does. He's pranking you. He's like, yeah, I'm going to give you Harrison Ford, and he's going to play a trombone, and he's going to talk about music. You didn't know he liked jazz, did you? Well, he does. He loves jazz.
This is probably the most sacred relic of my people's past.
Well, here's a sacred relic of my past. Reminds me of working my way through the University of Chicago.
You planned that?
No, I was a waiter. Colosimo's restaurant. Best food, best service, and best jazz in Chicago.
Exactly, and I think that was absolutely the point too, trying to legitimize the different framework of the series, it's a fun episode. I like it a lot. After this point, the series goes off the air. Lucas, though, is not ready to let it go, and so he starts producing 4 made-for-TV movies that came out on the Family Channel around that time. Ray, I wonder if you could talk a bit about just like the nature of made-for-TV movies, which were a huge thing back then. Now I think they're kind of relegated to like Lifetime, or I guess we could say some of the streamers. But like this era where not only were like these were huge. This was huge business back then. Huge business. It's what are your memories of that?
Well, the whole MOW thing was, you're right, was a huge piece of the programming. Probably at that point, not quite as heavy as it was. The 70s and 80s, the TV movies was an entire thing. I remember, like, by the mid 90s, it was a lot of sort of soap opera-y stuff, like probably the stuff that ended up becoming what Lifetime ended up becoming, or Hallmark Channel, or whatever. So the TV movies had been downgraded a bit, but the key in there is the Family Channel, because that was low rent.
New from executive producer George Lucas, a world premiere movie.
Who are you? Indiana Jones.
From the battlefields of Western France to the treacherous jungles of New Guinea. It's high seas adventure as Young Indy goes in search of an ancient treasure.
The eye of the peacock. You must stop him.
Don't miss Young Indiana Jones and the Treasure of the Peacock's Eye, only on the Family Channel.
I remember being kind of surprised when they showed up on that channel. Obviously the production values were what Lucas had, but there just wasn't the reach, I'm trying to remember the advertising, because I think I stumbled across them. I don't think I knew they were going to be on and then made a point to watch them. I did see them, but I'm pretty sure it was a little harder to get to at that point.
It was so true. I think it's, I can't recall if the Family Channel was owned by ABC at that time or if it was its own thing.
I don't think so, because it was actually owned by Fox before it was owned by ABC.
There you go.
But Fox called it the Fox Family Channel. So it's every reference I've ever seen, and you remember better than I, Ray, but it was just the Family Channel. So I would assume it was still an independent cable operation, which, to your point, was not a prestigious channel, at that time. And I don't even know, honestly, if the audience on that channel would have really been into that. I
might be wrong about this, but my remembrance of the Family Channel is it started as a religious channel. I think it was owned by Pat Robertson originally.
Oh, that's correct.
Dreams are coming true. Dreams we want to share with you. The Family Channel, together with family.
Yeah, and then it was purchased. I forgot that Fox had it, because I knew ABC got it at some point. But yeah, it was not. Oh, let's watch it on HBO because that's where we see quality. It was it was probably on the same level as USA got better later, but in those days USA was considered, like it was C level kind of stuff. So I was real surprised when Indy ended up there. Felt a little sad for it, actually.
Well, for those of you listening, the Family Channel still exists. It's called Freeform now. It may not exist for much longer, but it exists now. And to your point, Pat Robertson made a deal when he sold it. He gets a certain number of programming hours throughout the year. And Freeform, if you're ever watching at that time, they do some really funny little like trollish videos where they're like, all right, everybody, we're about to go off the air now. Come back. I give you a time, like come back at this time and we're back. It's if you look them up on YouTube, you can watch the whole series of sort of Freeform, we're signing off now videos. It's hysterical. I recommend you look these up.
Ray, do you recall any other like Family Channel content that was on at the time? Like what was it up against? That era?
Do you mean on that channel or just in general?
Yeah, just like, if you have any recollection, I know that, this was, it's not a watch channel.
Peter wasn't able to find the ratings for the Family Channel.
Honestly, I don't. I suspect it was a lot of reruns of stuff from 10 years before, because the whole thing with Family Channel was nothing to offend anyone. So I think there were probably, as I said, very innocuous stuff. I don't really recall.
Some of the shows that would be on there would be Big Brother Jake.
I'm going to show you everything you're going to need to know to really win this girl over.
Jake, has Andy all fixed up?
I did arm her with some pretty powerful weapons.
Wow! Some weapons! Big Brother Jake. Tonight at 7:30 on the Family Channel.
The Adventures of Black Stallion.
It's the extraordinary story of the strength, splendor, and speed of a stallion born to run, and of a young boy competing in a man's world. Don't miss the adventures of the Black Stallion, today at 5:30 on the Family Channel.
Rin Tin Tin, Canine Cop. I think I watched that.
He's the best pal a boy could ever have.
Awesome catch.
He's fun. He's adventurous. He's the talented.
It's rad, Lindsay.
Totally awesome. Rin Tin Tin, Canine Cop. Tonight at 7, 6 Central, exclusively on the Family Channel.
Maniac Mansion, which I think is important because that was actually a Lucasfilm show done by Eugene Levy, who created that. It's a bit forgotten now, but it was quite well regarded, if I recall, at the time.
What's he talking about? Maniac Mansion, a daringly witty look at the far side of family life. You've met Brett, the oblivious head of household. Then there's Casey, his wife.
Is there a law that says a mother can't be snippy with her own kids?
Speaking of the kids, Ike's got a James Dean fixation. Tina's a true teenage genius. And Turner's the baby of the family mutated into a baby Huey. Plus there's Uncle Harry, the hapless house block. Time magazine calls Maniac Mansion the looniest, sweetest family comedy of the year. The best of 90. See it here on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, only on the Family Channel.
And then the new Zorro, which was a short-lived live-action show.
All great men leave their mark. But one legendary signature stands alone. A lone swordsman who fought for justice in the early West. A lone swordsman whose mark struck terror in the hearts of his enemies. Zorro! Zorro, the legend continues. Fridays at 6 and 11 and weekends at 6:30, only on the Family Channel.
I don't think this is connected to the Disney one. Oddly had Daniel Craig in it as a guest star at one point.
So did Young Indiana Jones.
Exactly.
So, British actors, they just act for money.
I think I vaguely remember seeing the show on once or twice, but it had like I presume anyway, it had like an all Mexican cast. All Hispanic cast. That was on the Family Channel for about 3 years. It seemed like they were trying, at least in the early 90s, to try to push into like Disney Channel territory in a way.
It was the heyday of cable. I mean, right? That was the launch of cable, kind of really.
That's
and
true.
There was this thought that, you could become a Disney, you could become something, right? You could build a business and you could become a channel. And a lot of these were sold and bought by conglomerates by the end of the decade. But I mean, it's. I always think of it. I think back as a kid. Watching TV in those days was a lot of fun. You had DuckTales and you had they had the old Batman on TV. Yes. I'd watch that. It was just, it felt like sort of a very innocent time for television, and maybe the sitcom, you kind of see that, so it's
like, and the nature of syndicated television too just meant that like these companies with a bit of money could just kind of self-finance a show and then find distribution for it that could earn it a chunk of change. Today's analogy would maybe be like the Tubies or the the ad-based revenue services that are doing pretty well, producing very low cost product right now. And like just recently, like a friend of mine showed me this show that Bruce Campbell had starred in the early 90s. Not Briscoe County Jr., which is a good one-and-done season show, but there was something where like he was like a spy in the Revolutionary War era, and he was like singing. There was this whole... See, you guys don't even know what I'm talking about. It's bonkers, and it's like a real show, but like I was just like, good, I'd never heard of this, and this was one of those syndicated shows. Let's just throw something at the wall, see what sticks, and it was a wild time.
Well, syndication and even we never had, I don't think there were ever laws in the U.S., but and maybe Ray, you can speak to this too, but wasn't there a point where they weren't allowed to own their own shows, the networks, and then that changed and they could start owning their shows? Was that in the 90s?
That would have been mid-90s. That was in Bill Clinton's era when they did away with all that.
So certainly when Young Indy is starting in that time, the networks were in this business of, we just got to acquire shows. We got to find shows. We got to buy shows. We'll make a deal with George Lucas. Great. And that's what we're going to do. But they couldn't just own their own shows. And that's why you maybe get some of this experimentation that you don't see, once you get to 2000, they're just going to make their own shows. It's kind of sad because you probably think of like a Seinfeld, would a network make Seinfeld if they were just making their own show?
It's very true.
You also had at that time a huge syndication market where the local stations, even the network affiliates, would fill up their off hours with these shows, and you had a lot of made in Canada stuff at that time. Pretty sure Black Stallion was a Canada show, and I mean like produced for Canadian audiences, not just shot there. That's kind of when all the Xena and Hercules stuff got started, because you could syndicate it in America to local stations. You could put it on basic cable. You could also sell it to places all over the world. And so you had a lot of this kind of, I don't want to say low rent, because that's probably not fair, but not produced on the same scale as network stuff. But you had all of these oddball shows because they were coming from all sorts of places. That all kind of went away when the networks could own their own shows, and also most stations now, they show all that lifestyle stuff because it's just cheaper to produce.
Yeah, that's the new syndication, right? Instead of buying a show from Australia, we're just going to make a cooking show, or you're going to make something like that.
I also just want to touch on really quick too that starting in 1996 and then up through 99. Lucas is trying to dabble into the VHS market for Young Indy and re-editing the show into these feature-length content, putting them out on VHS as a way to try to make a lot of revenue. In a way, maybe a little late to the party, but I think in the late 80s, early 90s, like the VHS market was just huge. Like the Roger Cormans of the world were just making hand over fist on these like essentially direct to VHS movies. I wonder if you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah, well, but when VHS came in the early 80s, when it became, everybody had one at that point. It came in a little earlier, but what went away was the grindhouse and the drive-in market. Like all of that kind of went away when video came in, and VHS became a place where those kind of movies could premiere. And then by the time you get to the early 90s, or I guess the later 90s with the TV show, you're starting to transition into the early DVD era. And at that point, you're still getting that, but it's probably a little past the heyday of the that was the year of like the direct-to-video sequel. So you'd make a movie, come out in theaters, it would do okay, and then there'd be like 10 of them. I think all the Michael Myers movies in the 80s. I've never seen one of them, but there's like 50,000 Children of the Corn movies, and that was all just done for the home video market.
Yes, right.
And but thriving, and that was the period where you could buy them everywhere. You could buy them in the supermarket. You could buy them. I don't even know if they had Target then, but whatever. So not a dumb move on their part to try to get it out there.
Yeah, I mean, I can't recall the specific example, but like I can recall hearing about direct VHS movies that would have budgets of like $10-20 million, which is just insane to think about, whereas today it's like but that just goes to show like the amount of money that could be had, because for kids like Daniel and me growing up, we'd go to a video store. That's where we would rent movies, and we would base our rentals not because we'd heard about them or because we watched them before, but just because they had a cool cover. That was it. And then maybe when you become a teenager, you rent them because there's nudity in it. But whatever. It's just, that's all.
It's funny, though, because you're right. It's not like today where even if you're into physical media, you just order it online, right?
Yeah.
Then you go to the video store, especially a rental store, and they don't have the movie you want or you were thinking of. You find something else, and you would discover something, and you would make the decision on the cover. And so, there was the knockoff movies, the Jurassic Arena, instead of Jurassic Park, that would be one shelf below. But I mean, I discovered Young Indy on the shelf video store, right? And they released it with the movies, so they had the similar art, right? So maybe Raiders of the Lost Ark was gone, but Treasure of the Peacock's Eye was next to it, and you'd be like, oh, what's this, right? And so it was a smart marketing decision. I feel like the VHS audience ran into the same problem the TV audience did, which was, oh, this isn't like Indiana. This isn't like Raiders of the Lost Ark. You've got it next to Raiders of the Lost Ark on the shelf. And I took it home and I watched it. And, if you were lucky, you got like Phantom Train of Doom and you were like, oh, this is kind of like Indiana Jones, but maybe you got Tales of Innocence and you're like, why is he running around with Ernest Hemingway? Like it's still doesn't really explain itself. But I enjoyed it. I watched Peacock's Eye first because I think that was the most common VHS because they packaged it with the trilogy. So that was everywhere. You could get that at a library. You could get that at a Blockbuster, anywhere. And then there was a great trailer on it. So I'm like, I want to find the war ones. So I found all the war ones. I was into, those were really great, right? So for me, it was a little bit of a hunt. It was like you were looking for this very rare thing in that world where you could not go online. I mean, Amazon.com existed, but I don't even know if they sold VHS tapes. So, you had to find them at a video store. There were catalog services, Columbia House. Yeah. You could order away. I'm sure these were on there, but it was expensive, to do that. And so the rental house was my Hollywood Video, which is gone. If you're listening, no one even probably knows what that is. But they had all the Young Indiana Jones, and that's where I would get them.
It was a beautiful time. I don't even remember. We had a local one. I don't even remember what it was called now, but it was I think it was just an independent, because that was the other thing. They weren't all chains. They would be some mom and pop video rental stores as well. And those were very important. But Blockbuster as well was right there. And then, as you said, like your local library was very important to access these things.
And actually the library, you could, at least in here in LA, you could go on the computer, and if they had it in the library system, and it was a big system, then you could have it sent to you, right? So that was actually maybe even one of the more sophisticated ways you could get a rare tape or something. You certainly could do that at a Blockbuster. They didn't, if your local Blockbuster didn't have it, that you had to go find the one that did. There was no have it sent here, So that was maybe a precursor of actually how things would happen later.
And they wouldn't tell you where it was. You just had to guess that the next.
Oh, they wouldn't know. Exactly. They'd be like, "Oh, you could try the one on across town. They tend to have good stuff."
And that was part of the joy. It was the hunt. It's the hunt. That's. Well, Ray, I mean, you've been very generous with your time here. We're about an hour period of time here, but thank you again for joining us on this Young Indy podcast. Daniel, can you think of any other questions we want to put to Ray here?
Well, the only thing I was going to ask, Ray, we've talked a lot about the history. I don't know. I'm guessing you've seen most, if not all of these by this point. These in Young Indiana Jones. I guess we'll call them films. Just to maybe end the conversation, which one, do you have a favorite? And which one is it? And
it's funny. I don't recall the titles of them that well. It's been a while since I've seen them. I remember liking the war ones very much. I thought that was maybe where the show shined the best. And I remember, you guys will know the name of this episode, but the one where he's at the treaty negotiations and he runs into the person who will later run Vietnam. And I'm not recalling all of the details, but I remember thinking it was very smart, very sad, very And for me, I thought this was quite intriguing. That's the one that always sticks in my mind. And I know there's one where he meets John IV.
Yeah, that's a great episode.
Paris, that's the one.
Yeah, the treaty one is Paris 1919, which you can see in Winds of Change, which I want to say is chapter 18 or 19. It's chapter 19 on Disney Plus. I love that one too. There's a great line at the end when he says, "We gave the old men victory and they threw it away. We offered them a new world and they built the old one over again." I think of that all the time. And it's a great episode.
It's interesting too. I recently went on to try to find, I had the thought that I should actually buy more copies of Young Indy just to have as backup, because I don't think Disney's going to be re-releasing these DVDs anytime soon. We're putting them out on Blu-ray, and it's like the Warriors one, the volume 2 is sold out. Like, it's very hard to find now. So I think a lot of people and a lot of fans agree with you, Ray, is that like the Warriors is where the series kind of really succeeds at, and the other 2 volumes are a bit more available. But Ray, thanks again for being on the show. What are you working on these days? What's new with you?
First of all, thank you for having me. I really had a good time. Appreciate it. I hadn't thought about this show in a while, so it was fun to go back over all of this. Working on a couple of more film-related books. I'm doing, for anyone who knows my King Kong book, I'm doing an update of that right now. That'll be the first one out, and then there's another one which I'll have to talk about another time. But I'm back in the world of King Kong right now, up to my neck in it. So it's been fun.
Well, I feel like we should have you back on when that book comes out, because I think there's a lot of overlap between Indy and King Kong and just that whole kind of franchise, the mythos there, and it would be a really interesting conversation. Just kind of
be very happy to do that. Thank you so much.
If listeners out there want to get in touch with you or learn more about what's new in your life,
I got a website,
where can people get in touch with you?
raymorton.com, and on Instagram it's raymorton1, so they can find me there.
Wow, Ray Morton, thank you very much again for being here today.
Thanks so much.
This was an awesome conversation. If you want to get in touch with us, listeners out there, find us on social media. And we will be back in the future with more of these episodes about the Young Indiana Jones television series. So for Daniel No and myself, thanks again, and we'll see you next time.
We gave the old men victory and they threw it away. We offered them a new world and they made the old one over again. Still, it might have been worse. What? I said it might have been worse!
Next time on the Young Indy Chroniclers.
We're thrilled to have Mr. Dan Madsen. Dan revitalized the Lucasfilm fan club and founded Star Wars Insider magazine.
It all started with Star Trek. Got a call from Lucasfilm. They said, we saw what you were doing with Star Trek. This was a time period when George was able to kind of actually pursue some projects he really wanted to do. This is a more thoughtful, more intimate kind of view of Indy. It didn't seem like a network kind of show. It was more like a PBS show.
This is like the X-Files. The answers are in there.
That was the first time we got an idea of who Indy's mom was.